Welcome to this video in the series Being Transgender. My name is Steph Polak, and in this short video I will be covering the basics on the nature of gender and sex, how we misunderstand these, and how this is reflected in our law. Essentially, a 101 course on gender, sex and law. So let's start by asking ourselves, what is gender? Well, in the context of neuroscience, gender is the attribute hardwired into our brains by our DNA and evolution that gives us our gender identity, the mental image we have of ourselves, including our sex, and a set of fundamental behaviors to support a gender role. These we combine to give us our gender presentation. That is how we present ourselves to and interact with the world. Gender can therefore be viewed as a core operating system application and part of the vast library of hardwired OS applications that are essential to surviving and thriving. Indeed, nearly all of what our brains does is run these hardware applications. Now, when we analyze people's genders, we find they exist on a bimodal spectrum. That is on a single continuous line of variation with two bumps under which most people fall. Given this, our society divides the spectrum into two, calling one side male and the other female, to which it applies constantly varying cultural rules based on a perceived associated gender role. Men wear trousers, women look after children, men like cars, and so on. But these division and rules are purely social constructs that are also referred to as gender. However, there are quite a number of people whose biological genders are fluid or are non-binary, sitting between the two bumps. And while we culturally may not acknowledge them, most other global cultures do, generally supporting 3 genders, but in some American tribes up to 5. There is nothing to say we should have 2 genders, biologically or socially. But, well, how does this relate to sex then? Well, sex describes the physiological attributes created by our DNA and evolution that enable us to physically procreate. Gametes, gonads, genitalia, and so on. It's the hardware we use to create successful offspring and, like biological gender, it too exists on a bimodal spectrum, with 2 bumps under which most fall. This we also divide into 2, calling one side male and the other female. However, the biology of sex is so hugely complex and continually varying that it is not, nor ever will be possible, to scientifically define this division. Biological variation is what drives evolution, and there are a significant number of people with a multitude of different intersex characteristics. As a result, the sex binary division is also, and will only ever be, a social construct. And again, there is no reason to only recognize 2 sexes, and many other cultures actually recognize 3. So, if sex and gender are different biological attributes, why do we mix them up? Well, quite simply, because we have always assumed that an individual always has the biological gender that matches their biological sex. Male sex, always male gender. Female sex, female gender. But the biology of sex and gender are completely different and distinct, and they are not intrinsically tied, which is incidentally why gender is not the sex of the brain. As a result, some people have a biological gender that is female, but a male biological sex, and some have a biological gender that is male, but female sex. Or, well, you could say it the other way around, especially given the brain is the most important organ we have. Either way, these people are transgender and have a very natural, normal biological condition that is not an illness, disorder, or ideology, that is a learned behaviour, and that cannot be caught, coerced into, chosen, converted, or cured. It's just how some people are, with roughly 1% being transgender, 2% being intersex, and roughly an equal number of trans men as trans women. But how do we know this? Well, because there have been hundreds and hundreds of different types of scientific study with peer-reviewed papers that show gender and being transgender has a biological etiology. We have even identified parts of the brain that are probably involved, though as the most complex object known to man, with 100 billion neurons and trillions of synaptic connections, unraveling this exactly is an almost impossible task. And then we have examples in nature. For example, the white-throated sparrow has 4 clear genders with identified natural brain differences, while nature and science also show that of the two, sex is the most mutable, with quite a number of animals changing sex during their lifetimes. On the other hand, all the research that has tried to find psychosocial etiology, that is, that it is caused by social environment or ideological indoctrination, have drawn a blank, while those few theories that have been put forward have been quickly discredited and disproven. Of course, the good thing here is that science is true whether you want to believe it or not. In short, gender and being transgender is biological, even if you have a false ideology that tries to claim otherwise. So, given this, how does our law treat sex and gender? Well, our law assumes that gender always matches sex, and that the words are therefore interchangeable. It assumes that the assessment of sex at birth defines both the sex and gender of the individual correctly and in law, and does not allow for this to be subsequently changed. It assumes that sex is binary and biologically definable, and therefore gender is too. Of course, all that we've just covered means that this is just all plain nonsense and leads to all sorts of unnecessary societal misunderstanding and confused legislation, which can be exploited by those with specific ideologies to cause significant harm. This is why there has been considerable effort to get our laws brought up to date based on modern scientific, non-ideological understandings of sex and gender. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it of interest and use, and if you want to understand more about being transgender, please do look out for the other videos in this series.